One of the most common patterns in JavaScript in the last 5 years is without a doubt the eventing pattern. So the eventing pattern is whenever you write some code that looks something like div.onClick, and then you pass in a function of something to do when that event occurs. So in this case, we are watching the div for a click event, and whenever that click event occurs, invoke this function right here. You use this with Firebase, Parse, Backbone, Angular, vanilla HTML elements, event handling, just all over the place. A very common pattern in JavaScript. So common, in fact, that if you go look up EventEmitter or just emitter on npmjs.com, you end up with 2100 results. So this eventing pattern is very common. And I want to spend a video today to figure out how to put together our own event system. So I want to make our own kind of class or our own object where we can create events and then trigger them later on. So let's look at a diagram of the API that we'll be putting together. This is going to be our EventEmitter class. We're going to create a single class. It's going to be an ES6 class and an instance of that class. So whenever we use that new keyword, we'll have two methods, on and trigger. We can use on to set up a listener for an event and a trigger to trigger an event. On will receive two arguments to it, the event name as a string, and then a callback to register to that event. And then whenever we call trigger with a very particular event name, like say on data or on click or on hover, whatever it might be, we should invoke every single function that is tied or registered to that event name. Now the key here is that whenever we have an actual event registered, we should be able to register multiple callbacks to that event. So I should be able to register a function to the data event like 10 times if I so chose, and every single one of those functions should be registered in line. So the first thing we need to do is figure out some type of data structure for our EventEmitter class, something to store all of these events, the actual strings, and the functions that are tied to each of them. I'm going to suggest that we use an object to store all these event names and all the callbacks associated to them. So perhaps on our instance, whenever we create an instance of EventEmitter, it will have a this.events object. The keys of the object will be the event names. So in this case, I have two event names registered, data and delete. And then for each event, I have an array of callbacks. So the data event has two callbacks, callback 1 and callback 2, and the delete event, which has callback 3 and callback 4. So if I trigger the data event, again, I expect to have callback 1 and callback 2 invoked. That's the goal here. So let's flip over to our code editor and give this a shot. Writing EventEmitter like this is, I gotta tell you, I have never seen an interview question as frequently as this. How do you write an EventEmitter in JavaScript? Again, we use this all the time in collections of different libraries, but how do you write it from scratch if you had to? So let's give it a shot. First, I know that I'm gonna need to make a class EventEmitter, because at the end of the day, I want to make an instance of an EventEmitter and then be able to register events and trigger events off of it. Now we had said that we want I gotta stop talking for a second and write that word out because for some reason it gets tough typing and talking. Now we just said that we want our EventEmitter instance to have a this.events property, which should be an object where we're going to store all of these event names and their callbacks. So inside the constructor, I'll say this.events is an empty object. If you're used to using classes with React components, you'll notice that I'm not calling super or props here or anything like that. I'm not calling super specifically because I'm not extending any other class. This is a base class right here, so I don't have any parent class to call the super keyword on. Now we know that this EventEmitter class is going to have two methods attached to it. It'll have on and trigger. So on is where I will register an event, and trigger is where I will actually call an event or trigger it with the intent of invoking every event that is, or excuse me, every callback that's tied with that event name. So let's take care of on first. I always expect on to be called with two arguments, event name and callback. Event name will be a string and callback is just going to be a function. And my goal here is to store them on the this.events object. So first I'm going to say, well, you know what, let's just do this very straightforward. If this.events at event name exists. So if I already have an event registered with this same name, then just go ahead and say this.events at event name dot push callback. So I'm assuming that there's already an array here, and I'm going to just add in the callback. Now I need to handle the case where I've never registered an event with this name at all, so I don't have an array on the object with that key. So in that case, I'll say this.events at event name is the callback inside of an array. So now if anyone comes again and registers another event, it will be pushed onto that array that we just placed there. And that's it for registering an event. Not too bad, right? Trigger is not that much more challenging, so let's do that one as well, and we can test this out. So with trigger, we'll take an event name, and now here's the key part, the part that I didn't really discuss too much. Whenever we trigger an event, we want to be able to receive some number of arguments as well. So if I do something like div.trigger click, and then I want to also pass along an event object perhaps. Remember how whenever there's a click event, we get along an event object as well. Perhaps we want to pass along the second argument, or an argument to the callback function. So we're going to assume that whenever trigger is called, it will be called with some number of arguments as well. And so I will put down the ... rest, which is going to collect all those different arguments. So if I might have like event1 and event2, just some arbitrary number of arguments. The .rest will take care of all those. Now inside of trigger, we can say if there are any events tied to this event name, we will take this.events at event name, and for each callback, I want to call that callback cb.apply with null and rest. And so what this is going to do is it's going to call the callback. It's going to use the apply function because we have an array of arguments right here. And when we use the apply keyword, or excuse me, method on a function and pass in an array, that array, everything inside of it will be passed as arguments to the callback right here. And that's pretty much it. That's all we need to call, or excuse me, trigger an event. Notice here that we are saying for each element in that callback, we want to call the callback itself. Using the word callback here a lot. Anyways, let's give this a shot down at the bottom. So now I can say const EE is a new event emitter. This lowercase EE right here is just a common convention I see all over the place whenever using a event emitter type object. EE stands for, of course, event emitter. Then we can register an event, ee.on, whatever, change. And then maybe I will console log, hello there. And you know what? I think I got a typo somewhere in here. Let's see what the error says. If this.events, I definitely believe that there's an error. Well, let's keep going all the way through, and if I can't fix it reasonably in a reasonable amount of time, we can just take my word for it that this actually does work. So at the very end, we would do EventEmitter.trigger change, and then I would expect that to invoke the console log right here. So now let's do a little bit of debugging. Hopefully I can figure this one out. If not, I'll tell you what, let's just take my solutions. There we go. I left off the closing bracket right here. Boy, I'm sure everyone who's watching this video is saying, hey, you doofus, you left off the bracket right there. All right, there we go. And then we got one more unknown token right here. Here, I'll tell you what, let's just take my solution right there. I don't know what's different about this. Okay, you know what, we're saying that's it right there. Let's go ahead and pop open the console. I'm gonna expect to see a console log of hello there. You'll notice that it console logged twice. That's just because of the way that my tool right here works and invokes code. In fact, it was really only invoked one time from this event. So that's it for EventEmitter. With EventEmitter, we set up a ES6 class. It has its own kind of data store of all the different events that get registered. And then whenever someone triggers an event, it will call all the registered callbacks, passing in some particular argument to it with trigger right here. Again, this is a pattern that you see throughout the entire JavaScript ecosystem, and it's also one of the most common interview questions I ever stumbled across. So do make sure that this is one where you think you could reasonably reproduce it in an interview. This is definitely one of those type of questions where you kind of either know how it works or you don't, and you kind of struggle in the interview figuring out how to put this together. So hopefully it's been valuable to see how to put together your own event emitter at least one time. If you like this video, I do weekly videos on JavaScript and the associated ecosystem. Check out rallycoding.com, sign up to the email list to get one new video once a week.